dead have not forgotten.
Reworks in general, irrespective of how the end result was achieved, are for the most part a positive change for the champion. I know this sounds a little ridiculous, especially having talked about an example that was no short of a balance mess, but objectively speaking, the champion is in a far better position now than they were prior. Their playstyle has a lot more room for skill expression, less monotony from game to game. Perhaps they have more agency in the way of carrying games. Whatever the case, reworks are a way for an old, outdated, or failed champion to be retrofitted into a more thoughtfully designed version of what Riot wanted them to embody. Now, the extent of their new iterations improving their standing within the roster fluctuates tremendously. Some may see drastic shifts, one's completely obscure pocket picks to consistently present in the meta, others may still remain a more niche option, a side grade or situational pick. Rarely if ever do I see a champion who doesn't witness some semblance of conventional viability after a visual gameplay update, at least not until this guy. Yorick was and is a champion with immense potential, being one of the rare few whose playstyle focuses on amassing an army of bodies to overwhelm the opposition through sheer pack size. And though he's most certainly doing better now than the dumpster fire that was his old one, his updated version has to this day struggled to get even a single foot in the door that is League's meta. Today, we're going to dig deeper into the rabbit hole of Yorick's Rework, a retrospective. Since its conception, Yorick has been characterized as one of the most interesting designs in the game. While other champions may have had a single ability that could instantiate summon creatures to fight alongside you, also known as pets, his entire kit consisted of summons, and unlike those other champions, a significant amount of his power budget was funneled into those summons, or rather that's all he was. Yorick himself was merely a monster spawner if you want to look at it that way. This unique concept essentially meant there were no rules gating the design team in any way, but it also meant there were no benchmarks that would put him on a level playing field against his competitors. With no summoner class, trying to estimate his relative power in comparison to others was easier said than done. It's a very simple task to notice if the likes of Old Irelia or Aatrox were overperforming because duelists at the time all did the same basic thing, and so the balance team just had to see if one was doing that basic thing far more efficiently than the others. The same applied for every other class, tanks, fighters, mages, and whatnot. Yorick, on the other hand, was a specialist, the class of champions who don't exactly conform to a standard. Historically, specialists were very hit or miss when it came to practical usability, but even then, champions such as Fiddlesticks or Heimerdinger could find common ground with other mages. Yorick had no one to compare himself to, and this had a huge influence on his presence in the meta, or lack thereof. I know for a fact that 90% of you watching don't even know what his pre-rework version even did, and I'm gonna level with you guys, I couldn't even remember until I did research for this video either. He was so unpopular that you would be lucky to find one Yorick every 100 games, maybe even 200. He was arguably League's most unpopular champion in the entire game, so let's go into what he was all about. Unholy Covenant was his passive. Whenever using a basic ability, he would summon a ghoul near his target, each having different properties and autonomously attacking anything that would be considered an enemy, prioritizing the ability's original target before going after any nearby enemy champion, then minion, then structure. On top of that, for every summoned unit alive at a time, Yorick himself would gain 5% bonus damage on his basic attacks and 5% damage reduction. Since his Q, W, E, and ultimate each contained one summon, he would be able to maintain as high as 20% bonus damage on auto attacks and 20% damage reduction. His passive alone should tell you everything you need to know. He gets stronger the bigger his army is, and so the goal is to fight him while he was alone or understaffed, so to speak. Omen of War was an empowered auto attack, causing him to deal bonus physical damage. Unholy Covenant would then summon a blue-colored ghoul with bonus attack damage and movement speed, making it the strongest and fastest of his 3 ghouls. While it was on the field, Yorick would ignore unit collision and acquire the same bonus movement speed. Omen of Pestilence was a small explosion in an area that dealt magic damage and slowed all enemies for a second and change, upon which Unholy Covenant would spawn a green-colored ghoul equipped with a slowing aura equal to half the slow of the initial attack. Ordinarily, Yorick's ghouls, especially at low level, were slow enough to where you could outrun them, so the green ghoul's job was to impede your mobility just enough to where you were forced to take them down the old-fashioned way provided you didn't have a dash. Omen of Famine was by far his most aggravating one, a point-and-click range attack that would deal magic damage and heal him for a portion of the damage dealt. Unholy Covenant would then spawn a red-colored ghoul that would heal him for 17.5% of its attack damage or 35% against champions. The numbers may not seem all that significant, but theoretically, one cast of Omen of Famine could regenerate him all the way from low HP to full if the ghoul was kept alive long enough, and that was surprisingly easy to do with his playstyle in lane. Yorick was the lane bully to end all lane bullies. Basically, for the entirety of lane, he would continuously send ghouls one after another to harass you and zone you away from the minion wave. Taking them down was no easy task either. They had no leash distance, and prior to patch 4.2, total slow immunity, which meant they could potentially chase you down all the way to your fountain. Even early on, each ghoul would take at least a couple hits to go down, and with Omen of Famine granting him near infinite sustain in the neutral game, taking on Yorick was a test of endurance and patience. You had to bear the brunt of his never-ending wave of ghouls until he ran out of mana while keeping yourself as healthy as possible, and then afterwards you could wipe him out, as without ghouls he was as worthless as Yuumi. But even then, if you were up against a good Yorick player, if there was even one at all, it wasn't simply as easy as taking down his little mooks. Omen of Death was his ultimate, where he would summon a clone of whoever he targeted that would remain active for 10 seconds. If the original champion died, the clone would reanimate them back to full health for another 10 seconds before dying for reals. Okay, the ability description has a very vague explanation for this ability, so let me elaborate on what it actually did. Think of it almost like Shaco's Hallucinate, except it can work on any allied champion he chooses. He can use it on himself, on his jungler, on his mid laner, ADC, what have you. Then, if the real champion dies, the clone would disappear and cast Renata's Bailout on the original champion, except rather than rapidly decaying health and a chance to survive intact, the champion would be perfectly normal, then die 10 seconds after, no matter what happened. Omen of Death was f***ing broken. Mind you, the Revenant had reduced health and attack damage, but it would essentially be the equivalent of turning a 1v1 into a 1v2. And even if you killed the real one, the Revenant would simply respawn the real one, and you'd have to kill them all over again or try to run away for 10 seconds. Unlike Shaco's ult, where you could more or less ignore the clone and go straight after the real one, Yorick's Omen of Death puts you in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Now hypothetically, imagine casting this on a Tryndamere or a Vayne or anyone with really high auto attack damage or on-hit effects.
Power of Evil tries to put some damage in reply. It's in fact Kickers that goes down first. Yellowstar pulling the attention on the backline while Featherfin and Steelback being zoned away by the Ghost of Christmas Past. We did see Power of Evil get given the Omen of Death and the Unicorns of Love come out with a fantastic team fight.
Yeah, it was stupid as hell. But back to him. Since the only condition to summon his ghouls was to use his abilities, at any point you got fed up with getting harassed repeatedly, if you dove on top of him, he could literally face roll over his keyboard and summon all 3 color ghouls plus a copy of himself simultaneously, meaning, if you want to go for an all-in fight, you had to be prepared to take on what could very well be a 1v5. And remember, those extra bodies increased Yorick's auto attack damage and reduced the damage you dealt to him, making it all the more difficult to do so. Few champions had as degenerate of a playstyle as Yorick. His entire objective was to get enough mana to make liberal use of his abilities to summon as many ghouls as possible. He would then use his massive army to stat check the living crap out of any melee champion that was dumb enough to fight him alone. Now, when I say stat check, I mean absolute stat check. See, even conventional stat checkers like Trundle, Tryndamere, and Nasus had elements in their kit that could vary in effectiveness based on timing or position. For example, the difference between a good Tryndamere and a bad one is how well you can manage his fury or timing your mocking shot to get the slow. Yes, fighting them ultimately came down to who had a bigger stick, but a layer of skill expression was still present, albeit minuscule. Yorick's only form of skill expression were cooldowns and mana costs. The bare minimum. There was no positioning, no timing, no manipulation of wave, absolutely nothing keeping you in check besides your cooldowns and mana. Mind you, his mana costs were some of the most exorbitant out of any champion, but once he got his hands on Tear of the Goddess and Frozen Heart, mana issues be damned. Face roll all over the keyboard to summon as many ghouls as possible, as often as possible to harass your opponent. And if they were tilted enough to engage on you 1v1, summon your entire army of ghouls and clone to blow them up to pieces. If the combined stat total of Yorick and his mooks exceeded yours, you lost. Initially, you might assume that with his ghouls he would always push the minion wave, allowing it to farm safely under tower and more importantly putting him at risk for getting ganked. The latter is true. Yorick's lack of escape or hard crowd control meant any strong ganking jungler like Lee Sin, Elise, or Nidalee could tear him apart, but that's assuming you, the top laner, could help him do so. Being shoved under tower against a Yorick is ironically the worst position to be in because you have to somehow find a way to last hit all those minions while dealing with them constantly chipping away at you with his ghouls. And thanks to Omen of Famine, it didn't matter if he took a tower shot or 2, he would just heal it right back up. Back in the day, it was very common for him to have a 50+ CS lead over his lane opponent as they would gradually miss a lot of last hits trying to fend off his summons. Oh, and one other thing, he did hybrid damage. His auto attacks, Q, and ghouls did physical while his W and E did magic. It made it that much harder to deal with them. See, being this linear of a champion meant that Yorick would only be able to perform well if the circumstances were correct. He was desperately reliant on lane matchups and even more reliant on closing games out quickly. Against an opponent like Jax or Irelia, the ghouls would be more of a hindrance than a help. The ghouls did only auto attacks, so Counter-Strike nullified them completely, and with enough levels and maybe a Triforce, Irelia's Blade Surge could one-shot reset on each ghoul, rendering them useless. Moreover, because its entire kit was nothing but ghouls, Yorick was one of the worst champions in the late game. With their stats scaling off his own, you would think as time went on and he got more stats and items, those ghouls would become unstoppable. But at the end of the day, they're just glorified minions. During a team fight, those ghouls would get eviscerated by all the splash damage running around, and like 80% of his pressure stems from those ghouls. Even in 1v1s, they wouldn't really be all that much better. Yorick's early game was so oppressive because at that stage in the match, champions don't have the attack speed, base damage, and cooldowns to spare on each ghoul, so something like last hitting under tower was difficult. Most of the time in the late game, Yorick was just a worse Zillion. He could ult the ADC and then do pretty much nothing else. His only viable strategy was to split push, and even then, so many other champions could do it more efficiently. You couldn't find a more black and white champion than this guy. He was as cheese as they came, and also kind of boring, as there was no other way you could play him besides gradually harass lane opponent to build a CS lead and then hope for the best. You couldn't really kill the enemy top laner unless they were stupid enough to all-in you, so it was more or less 20 minutes of neutral game. New Yorick sought to allocate his power budget a bit more practically by placing an equal amount of his combat pressure in both the champion and his minions. They were also aiming to make it so he could force interactions and engagements rather than playing tower defense where he would just send one goon after another. First things first, all ghouls were standardized, meaning there were no longer minions with different effects based on the ability cast. While this took all variety out of his summons, it opened up more of his power budget to be used on other things. His ghouls, which were renamed to Mistwalkers, are now only tied to his passive NQ, as opposed to all of his abilities. Dark Procession creates destructible terrain around a target location, trapping any enemies inside. The wall remains until after 4 seconds or if it's destroyed through basic attacks. It's not exactly hard crowd control, but hypothetically Yorick has a way to trap enemies in place. Although this ability is notoriously difficult to land, and even then it's destructible terrain, you can get rid of it in 2 attacks at rank 1, so it wasn't like a J4 ult. Morning Mist is a mid-range projectile that damages all enemies hit and slows them. Any enemies hit are marked for 4 seconds, during which they take bonus damage from Mistwalkers, and said Mistwalkers gain bonus movement speed when running toward them. Also, Mistwalkers can now jump straight on top of champions regardless of distance. These 2 abilities are how Yorick can manipulate his ghouls in such a way that they pose a veritable threat to your life instead of an annoying inconvenience. Yorick can stack up ghouls, trap you in place, then have them claw away at you until you die. It definitely makes for a more interesting champion, as now he has ways to push his advantage. Additionally, Yorick's ultimate is now a proper summon. Eulogy of the Isles summons the Maiden of the Mist, who remains out on the field indefinitely until she dies. On recast, he can set her free to push whatever lane she's in as if she was a glorified super minion. With clever macro plays, Yorick is able to help his team gain control of side lanes while being present in fights, though most of the time he prefers to split push anyway. So he did lose a lot of early game pressure and became much more difficult to play, but Yorick's overall kill pressure has gone up tremendously. Prior, he could only really take you out if you forced an interaction with him, but with his new repertoire of abilities, he and his new Mistwalkers could tear you to shreds, not just you but also your towers. His split pushing capabilities have been vastly enhanced to the point where he takes down towers faster than anyone else in the game. Furthermore, his swarming pressure has become more dangerous, especially with his ultimate. Every time he takes down a minion with either Q or while his maiden is alive, it spawns a grave, and his Q is only a 25 mana cost. Yorick went from one of the highest mana champions in the game to one of the lowest honestly. His ghouls are a lot squishier than before on account of being one-shottable by auto attacks, but he can get more of them out. It's not uncommon for Yorick to summon like 15 ghouls a minute, maybe 20. There's just one problem though. Notice how all the good things I said about him were very similar to the good things about him before. He's good at chipping away at your health with his minions and discouraging one-on-one confrontation for most champions. Anyone who lacks dashes will struggle to deal with his pressure. Yorick's rework basically made him better at what he was already good at while doing little to nothing to address the things he really sucked at. Let me explain. First, Dark Procession and Morning Mist have granted him more accessibility in terms of getting his ghouls on top of his opponents and maximizing their damage on him, but it came at the cost of him not being able to summon them on demand, and remember, a lot of his power budget was siphoned out of his ghouls and back into him. Yorick's Mistwalkers may be able to jump to their target, but he can't. Champions with dashes or range can still kite him easily. Second, he's still easily shut down by champions with strong all-in or rushdown. In fact, he's become even more vulnerable to all-in champions since he lost a lot of his overwhelming sustain and the ability to revive himself. The Maiden of the Mist is a strong ally to have, but losing Omen of Death was a huge blow to his dueling capabilities. Old threats like Jackson Irelia still destroy him no problem, but there are a lot of new threats, some of which can turn his own summons against him. Set doesn't need minions to stun him with Facebreaker, a Mistwalker counts. Mordekaiser's ultimate zaps him into the Shadow Realm, completely isolating him from the assistance of his Mistwalkers. His individual power may be a lot stronger, but he's still reliant on his summons to help out. Third, he lost a lot of consistency. Old Yorick's strength was his consistency. He was consistently bad, mind you, but consistent nonetheless. If at any point someone were to engage on him, he just had to call for help by mashing his face on the keyboard, and boom, those ghouls would show up faster than Amazon Prime same-day delivery. With current Yorick, barring his ultimate, he has no way to summon a massive army on demand anymore. It takes a lot of time to set them up. All in all, his attributes have changed, but his situation hasn't. They fixed a good number of his old problems, but replaced them with new ones. Over the years, they tried to give him quality of life adjustments such as Morning Mist continuously activating graves, similarly to how Alawi's Test of Spirits summons tentacles, but commanding his minions and Maiden is still difficult to do. And he has a lot of tools that sound great in theory, but not so much in practice. Juggernauts are valued for their on-demand pressure, their ability to start fights whenever the hell they want. Yorick is a Juggernaut, but he doesn't have that kind of consistency anymore. Empirical data suggests he's doing a lot better than before, but given how non-existent he was back then, anything was better than old Yorick. From what I can tell, Yorick is a very fun champion to play in the sense that it feels really empowering to command a massive army of bodies, not to mention the satisfaction of two-shotting towers, but the fundamental problems that plagued his design before still remain today. I will defend him on the front that it's not entirely his own fault. If you watch my video on summons, you'll know why they're never allowed to be good. But I do feel bad for the poor guy. You would think with the improvements they gave his kit over the years and the inclusion of Hullbreaker, he would become more popular, but funnily enough, non-split push champions make better use of Hullbreaker than the big split pusher himself. Sad to say it, but I think Yorick was a failed rework. He was obscure before and stayed obscure now. He hasn't really been able to find a meaningful purpose in top lane. Anything he does, someone can do better or with less steps. All the same, I do think his current version is a vast improvement over his old one, just not enough. If you guys enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and subscribe. Consider following me on Twitter, joining my Discord server, and checking out my previous retrospectives if you haven't yet. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the next one. Take care.